Well, again, just to remind you, on this course on science, religion and atheism, we are looking at the way the science-religion narrative looks from different perspectives, both from a number of different disciplines and from the theistic, agnostic or atheistic points of view. And it's a great privilege now to introduce Professor Keith Ward, who is Emeritus Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford, formerly Professor of Philosophy of Religion at King's College London. A very distinguished theologian and philosopher. He started life doing philosophy indeed, and then of course divinity, and has written numerous books. Why There is Almost Certainly a God, beautiful little book. The Big Questions of Science and Religion, Is Religion Irrational? And we've got quite a selection of Keith's books downstairs on the bookstall. So it's a tremendous privilege to have you, Keith, to talk about a theist's perspective on the philosophy of science and religion.
Well, after Michael's talk last night, I think I should begin by saying where I stand or where I come from that came to me. And I think, honestly, the most important thing about me is that I believe that I apprehend the sense of God as a living reality, and that I had a specific experience of the presence of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And I believe that Christ appeared to me. So I'm probably insane, but anyway, that's what I believe. The most important part of my life is certainly prayer and meditation. And so that's the most important thing for me. And the thing I want to say about that is it has nothing to do with science whatsoever. It's not to do with that. It's just like falling in love with my wife. In fact, that's the nearest thing I can think of to it. There might be somebody you fall in love with and you hope there's only one of them. And in the case of God, it's a bit like that. It's a bit like just your life being totally transformed by a seeming apprehension of a spiritual reality which is greater than you and other than you. And it doesn't necessarily carry a whole theoretical baggage along with it, but of course if you're a Christian there is a lot of stuff that you pick up along the way. But that sense of transcendence and of transcendent spiritual reality is the most important thing in my life. So that's where it is. So science is not going to do anything to that unless the scientific results are so overwhelmingly proven that I just have to say I was deluded. So when I read books like Dawkins' The God Delusion, I realise he thinks I am deluded. And what can I say? I mean, I've done my best not to be deluded, but there it is. I'm not always drunk. And I can cope
yourself, Keith.
Yeah. So there it is. Then the next thing about me is that I've always, when I've had a job, been a philosopher. I started teaching formal logic and I went on teaching philosophy. But I was very interested in religion, and so eventually I turned into a theologian, but a very philosophical theologian. Now that's interesting because my two teachers at Oxford, or three teachers really, who might be well known, are Gilbert Ryle, A.J. Eyre, and Geoffrey Warnock. None of them was interested in religion at all. I might say they had no interest in that. But they had very different views. In fact, they were as different from each other as you could possibly be. And from that, I learned very early in my life that philosophers do not agree with each other. In fact, philosophy produces deep disagreements. There is no consensus in philosophy whatsoever. I've just been to Paris, as a matter of fact, at the Sorbonne, and I assure you that what they call philosophy has nothing in common with what we in Britain call philosophy. So there are very different ways of doing philosophy, and on the whole, in Paris and other places on continental Europe, existential phenomenology, as it's called, is still a major philosophical area, whereas it's not particularly in Britain. So I was studying with Gilbert Ryle at the same time as Daniel Dennett. As a matter of fact, we were both pupils of Gilbert Ryle at the same time. And I have to tell you that when Daniel Dennett says, as he does, that Ryle was a materialist, he is absolutely wrong, and he's lying because he knows that Ryle was not a materialist. Gilbert Ryle would not have considered materialism a possible philosophy. In fact, nobody in Oxford did when I was there. One person did. There was an Australian, I remember, coming from Australia where materialism began, really. It's all that Foster's lager. His name was David Armstrong, and he wrote a materialist theory of mind. I remember him turning up in Oxford when I was there. And nobody could believe that there was such a thing as a materialist. How things have changed. A.J. Ayer, of course, was the opposite of a materialist. Now, I don't know if you know A.J. Ayer. I won't assume that you do. Yeah, he was the person who popularized the philosophy of the Vienna Circle, logical positivism in Britain. And his philosophy began from a very traditional British approach, empiricism, which is that all our knowledge begins with experience. Now, that's the opposite of materialism. Okay, that's the exact opposite. For a materialist, if they're really hardline, like the Churchlands, they don't believe there are any experiences, rather, there are only brain events, so you don't start with experience. But for H.A.L. you start with experiences, what he called sense data, or now often called qualia, sights, sounds, touches, etc. Things like that. And then Ayer thought that the public world, the world of physical object, is a construct out of your private experiences. So that was one sort of philosophy that was very popular. It was very popular. Now, I was an atheist, so he was no believer in God, but as a philosopher, he was an idealist. And by an idealist, I mean you start with mental phenomena of consciousness. That's where you begin from. And then you ask, how do you get to beliefs about the world, about other minds, about the past, about whether the future is going to be like the past, about laws of nature, about a public world. How do you get to that from your private experiences? That was his question. Now, the funny thing was that Gilbert Ryle, who was just down the road in Oxford from Ayer, thought there were no experiences at all of a private sort. And Gilbert Ryle, though he was definitely not a materialist, was, I suppose, what we call an ordinary language philosopher, would be called then. Very like Wittgenstein in Cambridge. Ordinary language is in order as it is. So when you do philosophy, you get rid of the problems, you dissolve the problems, you don't solve them. There are no problems to solve, you just realise how you've been confused by language. So Gilbert Ryle once famously said on a BBC radio programme about the mind, because his great book was The Concept of Mind, where he invented the expression, the ghost in the machine, the ghost somewhere in the machine of the body. And he argued against that, of course. But he was asked in this radio programme whether he knew anything about psychology. And he said, no, I don't know anything about psychology. I'm concerned with the concept of mind. So that's how philosophy was done in those days. And of course things changed. But I think it is remarkable that then, this was the 1950s, late 1950s, materialism wasn't even on the horizon. Or it was over in Australia. We knew there was somebody in Australia. And now there are quite a lot of people, they mostly call themselves naturalists now. And Samuel Blackburn, one of the professors of philosophy here at Cambridge, is a naturalist. But in fact, I've talked to you about what naturalism is, and I'm not exaggerating when I say he cannot give a definition of it, except that it excludes the supernatural. And if I ask him what the supernatural is, he says it's anything that's not natural. So it's obviously God, that's what it obviously is, or spirits, or spiritual reality. But they get in trouble, naturalists, when they talk about morality. Quite a lot of naturalists now in Britain, professional philosophers that is, do want to talk about objective moral truths, and also about objective mathematical truths, which talking about this morning a little bit. So that naturalism is rather peculiar and hard to define. There are really very few hardline materialists, that is, people who say, I mean, a hardline materialist is somebody who says everything that exists, and if you're even harder, anything that could possibly exist has to be an object in space and time. And most naturalists in Britain do not say that, because they say, well, there are probably moral truths, but we want to give a naturalist explanation of what they are. Because that's not actually forthcoming. Nobody's really done it. Right? It's hard to know how you do that. So philosophy is something I've always been interested in, but my background is in that era, in the 1950s, I suppose, of saying that experience is the beginning of knowledge. So you begin with knowledge of experience, and then you ask, how do you get big beliefs about the nature of the world and so on. That means I've never really seriously considered materialism as an option. I'm impressed by the fact that some philosophers do. I think it takes a very good philosopher to be a materialist because it's such a difficult theory to believe. So you have to be a very good philosopher to explain how it is that conscious thoughts aren't really what we think they are, but they are identical with brain states. Now, I'm not talking about that as such, but I'll just point out that for a philosopher, the concept of identity between a brain state and a conscious state is sui generis. I mean, there's nothing else like it anywhere in the universe, and I don't think it's coherent personally, but you have to invent a concept of identity by which something that is an electrical discharge of neurons in the brain is identical with a thought that you experience. Right? And that sense of identity is quite unlike any other sense of identity. Now, I think it's a serious problem. I was talking to David Papineau the other day. He's a naturalist philosopher at King's College London. And I asked him why he thinks that there are only material causes, because that's one of his beliefs, there are only material causes. And he said, well, he couldn't see any evidence of anything else. And so I asked the obvious question, well, what about when you make a decision to do something and you decide to do it and you do it? And he said, well, actually it's probably the brain which is making that happen, and your decision is just an afterthought. And I just said, does it really seem like that to you? And he said, no, it doesn't seem like that to me, but that's what it is. So I just want to know how he knows that's what it is. And I think it's just an extreme use of Occam's razor, really, that you just eliminate things you don't absolutely need. Well, this is where it's relevant for me to say that I believe I apprehend a purely spiritual reality of God. And if somebody says to me, you don't need God, that seems such a strange thing to say. Of course I don't need God, just God is there, I'm just aware of God. Now I know a lot of people aren't, and that's a problem for me. Either they've got to say I'm deluded, or I've got to say they are blind. And I do have to say, yes, they are blind. But then that doesn't worry me too much, because I think a lot of people don't appreciate music either. And I think they're missing something very important in life. But I know there are people like that. They could learn, but for various reasons they don't. And some people are just tone deaf, of course, and then they can't even learn. So maybe that is genetic or whatever it is, but I don't think you can dismiss it by saying, well, we know that it's not true. And evolutionary psychologists who try to explain the origin of religious belief by making up just so stories about what happened when they don't have the slightest idea, in fact. What they do is to say, we're not saying whether these beliefs in God are true or false, of course. And then they said, but of course they're all false. So evolutionary psychology is a very difficult subject, which in fact usually assumes that beliefs in supernatural, that is to say non-physical entities, are all invented to fulfill some psychological need. And I just say it just feels wrong. I mean, if somebody says that to me, I think I'm a perfectly balanced psychological individual. What's that they are? And I don't feel any great psychological need. It just happens to be the case. You don't believe other people think because you need to. It's not a psychological need. You just think that's the way the world seems to be. So if you ask what is religion, then, we're talking about a theist view of science, then, to start off with a theist view, I have a rather broad view, which is based on my own experience. And it is, I think, what religion is about, what this coming Holy Week in the Christian calendar is about, is learning to overcome selfishness and pride and lust and hatred and greed and egoism in all its forms, and to achieve a conscious relationship with a reality of supreme compassion and bliss and joy and wisdom. And I believe that is the spiritual quest. And again, this is a matter of experience, and I believe there are people who have these experiences, and I have them to a limited extent, and I believe other people have them to a much greater extent. So that's what religion is about. What could science do to this? Well, two main things to do. Evolutionary psychology might try and show how beliefs like this could have originated, and that might indeed be very interesting, but it wouldn't be of primary interest to me, because it's a bit like saying how do you come to have a belief in evolution, for example. I mean, how do you come to have a belief? What I want to know is it true? So the genetic explanation of how the thing originated is probably irrelevant to the question of whether it's true or not. So you want to know evidence, and of course I would say experience is evidence. So here's a crucial question. Do you count personal experience as evidence? The people like Richard Dawkins are always saying there's no evidence for God. And I say, but I apprehend God. You say, that's not evidence. Well, why not? If you go back to A.J. Ayer, he would say when Ayer talked about the verification principle, what he meant was, in your own personal experience, you can tell that something is true. Ayer was not interested, or didn't even think it was possible, to publicly confirm your private experiences. Right? It's a big misunderstanding about Ayer that many people, probably school children, anyway, have, which is that he thought verification means you ought to be able to publicly confirm that something is true. That again is the opposite of what Ayer thought. He thought you couldn't publicly confirm anything, because you usually sit in philosophy stand up and say, I don't know if any of you are thinking. We would just reply, well, we don't know if you're thinking either. So but of course you do believe that other people are thinking, but you don't have any evidence for it. If you do, according to Ayer, it's private evidence. It's your own sense experiences, it's your own consciousness. So other things being equal, I think that's perfectly good evidence. So there's lots of evidence for God as far as I'm concerned. But what you think God is, of course, is not given to you in your experience. So you don't just have experiences. Now I think apprehension is the basis of religion, and it's the whole of human life. But you have to interpret, you have to have a conceptual framework to say something about your experience. And that's where, of course, questions of science come in, and questions of fact come in. And the sciences have altered views about God. For example, the obvious ones are, well, the size of the universe. There's probably nobody in the days when the great texts of the religions were written knew about the size of the universe. And that's going to affect what you think you apprehend when you apprehend a spiritual reality. Fritjof Capra came up this morning. He thinks, actually Fritjof Capra is a Californian, of course, and his version of Zen Buddhism is very Californian. It has not much to do with what happens in Japan, but nevertheless, he would have an interpretation of his experience which he would see as Eastern rather than Western. Now, I think if you study Zen Buddhism and you study various meditative and contemplative movements within the Christian church, you find out it's a lot more complicated than that. And what people call Eastern thought is usually these days, at least in Britain, something that came from California. And would be renounced by anybody who didn't come from California. Although I went to Thailand to a Buddhist monastery and had a talk with the abbot, because Buddhists are supposed to believe in a doctrine called anatta or anatman, no self. There is no self. And I said to the abbot of the monastery, you are Buddhist, you believe there's no self, there's no soul, there's no continuing person which remains identical throughout all your experiences, don't you? And he said, what a load of rubbish. No, of course we believe in self. And I said, but you're the abbot of this monastery, how can you believe that? He said, no, we've always believed that. And he turned out to be an American military policeman, as well. Converted to Buddhism. Anyway, it's such a funny world. And things get mixed up in lots of different ways. You do have to have interpretations in religion. You have to have. So I've got a very vague one, as you'll understand. If you rely on your experience, it's going to be very vague. And if you want to fill this out in any way, more concretely, well, you have to have an interpretative formula. And that's where science, of course, will be relevant, because it will give you some of the parameters of respectable interpretations and how you can do that. But for me, it's an axiom that nothing that a scientist said as a matter of theory could undermine my experience. And I do believe, as a philosopher, that all knowledge derives from experience. So if somebody comes along as a philosopher and says, experience doesn't even exist, if that could be replaced by a talk of firing of fibers in your brain, I couldn't even begin to believe that, because I'd say, but your knowledge doesn't begin there. That's a theory. I've actually got experiences, and I want to know how to analyse and talk about those. If you're familiar with existentialist philosophy in general. That's the starting point. It's also the starting point for Descartes, also the starting point for the whole of English and empirical philosophy. That doesn't mean it's all true. It means it's a perfectly respectable philosophical basis for beginning here. I want to talk a little bit about two sorts of explanation, which I think are important. I think religion does involve explanation, but of a very specific sort. And I want to distinguish, it's not my distinction, nomological from axiological explanation. And by nomological explanation, I mean this is what sciences typically do. There are all sorts of sciences, but a good basic natural science would be interested in nomological explanation. That's law-like explanation. So to explain why an event happens, you first of all define the event, it's physical, you measure it, you give it a quantity, a specific quantity you hope, and then you formulate a law, presumably in an equation which again has to be precisely specifiable mathematically, and you account for the event by giving the law and the initial state from which the event would follow, and that's nomological. So what you do, it's law-like. You say this event happened because there's a law, like the law of mechanics, the law of gravity, and that says that in a closed causal system, this is what will happen. And that's a perfectly good form of explanation, and we certainly need it to understand the world well. But there's another form of explanation. I mean, there are many other forms of explanation. As Wittgenstein says, you should never think there's only one form of anything. Anybody who says there is nothing but is always wrong. Okay? There's always another form of explanation. So there are lots. There's explanations you use in history. There are explanations you use if you're teaching music to people. There are explanations that you use, and this is what I'm interested in morality and in matters of value. And the big distinction I want to make this morning is between fact and value. Now, a positivist would have made that distinction by saying facts are things which are there, they're objective. And A.J. would say values are just subjective, they're just kind of, you make them up, the matters of taste, you just make them up. In fact, he changed his opinion before he died, but I won't go into that. But there is a question about value. Are values objective? And by this I mean to ask, is it the case that some values are, it is true that some things are of value and other things aren't, whether or not anybody thinks it's true. That's what I mean by objective. Does it make sense to say that it is true that you should not kill the innocent? Is that true? Even if everybody thinks you should. Right? So it doesn't matter what people actually believe. Could there be such a thing as a moral truth? And it's been quite fashionable for some years to say, no, there are no moral truths, but on the whole, people don't really believe this in practice. I get this when I talk to schools, which I do, sixth formers, they do philosophy papers now very often. It's the most popular subject in Britain at A-level, at the moment. And the question would be, do you believe in apartheid? Do you believe in separating the races and treating one's inferior to another? It's certainly not. No, that's perfectly wrong. And I'll say, but do you believe there are any objective moral truths? So why don't you just leave them alone to get on with it? Because that's their opinion. It's as good as yours, isn't it? And then they get confused. As they should, because of course there are objective moral truths. And the fact that we don't know all these truths is not an objection to that theory, it's actually a confirmation of it. Because if you say there are some objective truths, you don't mean that you know what they are. You probably mean, as in physics, that you're not quite sure what they are, and some of them you certainly don't know. So I should think most of the fundamental laws of physics we certainly don't know. We only have the slightest inkling of some of them. But if we say there is an objective truth, we mean we've got to try and find it. There's something to find. If it was just a matter of subjective opinion, you just make it up. It's just your opinion. It doesn't really matter. You say what you like. So believing in objective truth means there is something to discover. And some people are better at it than others. And it takes hard discipline to find out what it is. And some people are right and some people are wrong. So the law of gravity extends infinitely throughout space, and that's true. And if you think it's not true, you're wrong. Right? So it's not a matter of being tolerant to everybody and saying, oh, you can believe what you like. It's a matter of saying, there are truths. So it is a perfectly respectable philosophical view. Of course it's disputed, as I say. Philosophers always argue. That's just part of the course. But it's a perfectly respectable view that there are objective moral truths. So some things are true, and the most obvious ones are you should not kill the innocent, you should be just, you should treat people fairly. You might be arguments about exactly what that means, but you should take everyone into account in some way. And you should be compassionate and sympathetic. And these are objectively true. If you don't believe them, you are corrupt and depraved. You're not just having a different opinion. I taught philosophy here in Cambridge. I was Director of Studies in Philosophy at Trinity Hall, and the professor here then was Elizabeth Anscombe, because she was a very traditional Catholic. And I used to talk to her a lot. It was difficult because she would only discuss the Bible in the Latin Vulgate edition, because that's the only way where the Catholic Church has ever officially accepted it. You know, it's very much out of date now. And it's wrong, the translation is terrible. Anyway, it made life difficult. But she was quite clear in her own mind. And I think she was quite a good philosopher. In case you don't know, she was a very, very good philosopher. And she would have said, well, certainly if you believe that you can kill the innocent, it's not you have a different opinion, you are actually corrupt. And I agree with her, that some views are corrupt, morally. And I would, in a school, if I was teaching a school, I wouldn't say, you can believe what you like, make up your own values, just decide it's your decision. I wouldn't say that. I'd say it's absolutely wrong to kill the innocent. And, that is not permissible. It's true. I would have a proviso, of course, that I don't think I'm infallible. Right? So I believe it's true would be the more correct thing to say, but I still believe it's true. It's not that I think I'm just forming an opinion, like I like cornflakes, I don't like Rice Krispies. It's not like that. I believe it's actually an objective truth for everybody. But I agree that I might be wrong, and so in some cases, if you brought lots of arguments and evidence, I might be able to change my mind. But I'd only change my mind if I thought the view that you were putting was more correct than mine, that there was more truth in it. So I want to have a certain amount of humility together with a belief in objective truth. Right, so an axiological explanation then is concerned with the objectivity of value. It's an explanation in terms of value, saying this is of intrinsic value. No, just two little definitions. An intrinsic value is something which is worthwhile for its own sake. Whether or not anybody thinks it's worthwhile, that's irrelevant. It's something which is just worthwhile. So if you don't think it's worthwhile, you're corrupt. Or if you're not corrupt, you're ignorant in some way. And an example of that would be a very simple one, Mozart's 40th Symphony. If you don't think that's a great work of music, you're either corrupt or you're ignorant. You might not like it, that's different. You might not like it, there's music I don't like. But I can still recognise what great music is and what bad music is. There are objective standards of value there. There are some disagreements about taste. Some people hate Wagner, but if they say Wagner is a bad composer, they're ignorant. He's not a bad composer. It's amazing stuff. You may think it's amazingly horrible. I mean, that's all right. Like I think about Tracy Emin in art, amazingly horrible. But still, you have to say she has the techniques of art. She can do it if she wants. Why she does all these scribbles, I don't know. But you know, she has the basic things that you need for value. And you can learn what she's getting at, or you can learn what Mozart's getting at. There is such a thing as learning musical appreciation. Now, I want to put religion in a box with all the humanities. Right? So in a way, I'm talking about the natural hard sciences versus, just a qualified thing, but versus the humanities, and the different ways in which people approach what it's reasonable to think in the humanities and in the sciences. And one of the things I want to say here is in the humanities, what we value above all, and I know this very well because I've appointed lots of people to academic jobs, and I know that what we look for is originality. We don't look for people who have the same ideas as everybody else, right? In fact, they'll never get a job if they have the same ideas as everybody else, because we just say that's been done, sorry. In the sciences, it is not necessarily true. You could be a scientist, and at least in the early stages of science, you simply have to agree. That's why kids don't like physics very much in school, often, because they just have to learn it. They can't really ask questions about it because they don't know enough to ask sensible questions. So they just learn it. Whereas when they do subjects like history or philosophy or art, they are asked their opinion, but they are also taught how to discriminate more practically and judgmentally. Phronesis is practical judgment, practical wisdom in Aristotle. Phronesis is what you want in the humanities, judgment, with originality and creativity. And that's what's important. I think that's true in religion, it's true in history, it's true in all the humanities subjects that you have. It's certainly true in philosophy. You look for an original philosophy. We like original philosophy. We don't like people just to repeat things. Dogma is the enemy of philosophy. When dogma means I'm repeating just something that I've heard and I'm not going to think about it critically. So critical thought is very, very important. And originality and creativity. What does this mean? It means, well, you'll be looking for creative disagreements. And again, there's a difference between just stupid disagreements. You disagree with something just out of awkwardness. And creative disagreements, where you can point out deficiencies in the view, and you can see things from a new perspective. I mean, that's when a philosophy begins. If somebody has a new perspective on something that hasn't been put that way before. So I think materialism is a fairly new perspective. It's about 30 years old, and you say, here's a new way of looking at things. Look at them as though, and you can explain everything in terms of evolutionary development of the brain. And I'm sure it won't last very long, but I mean, there it is, because it won't last very long because we're going to look for another new perspective which will transcend it. Not say any attempt to find something that's going to be the final word is bound to be insufficient. So you're looking for creativity, you're looking for originality, but you're looking for value. You're looking to train people's minds so they can discriminate what things are intrinsically valuable and what aren't. So intrinsic value is something that's worthwhile for its own sake alone. Well, I think you're doing this when you ask simple questions like, why do you do the things that you do? Why are you interested in science? Why do you have that interest? And a perfectly good answer to that question is to say, well, simply because those are the things I'm interested in. I look around at the available knowledge there is. I have a lot of knowledge of possibilities. I evaluate them, and I find that I'm interested in some of them. And I'm personally interested in cosmology. I have great interest in it. I'm not a professional cosmologist at all, but I just happen to find that fascinating. And it's a very good reason for doing it that I find it interesting. I find it intrinsically worthwhile. And that's why I read about it, or learn about it, and talk to people about it. So the answer why there is given in terms of three things. First of all, knowledge. I have to have knowledge, consciousness. I have to have evaluation. I have to evaluate things relatively, choose some over others. And I have to have a decision to do something about it. So, an intention. So, in axiological explanation, that is explanation in terms of value, axia is the Greek for value, explanation in terms of value, is saying, to give an explanation of that sort, is to ask what things do people know about, what things do they evaluate highly and less highly, and what things do they decide to do. And those concepts of knowledge and evaluation and decision do not occur in the natural sciences, like physics, chemistry, the hard sciences. They don't occur because that's not what they're interested in, because the hard sciences are interested in nomological explanation. I think you need both, but if you don't have axiological explanation, you can't understand anything that's truly human. And my philosophical position is that you cannot reduce one to the other. There is no way, in principle, of reducing axiological explanation to a nomological explanation. In very sophisticated philosophers like Dan Dennett will try and do that. I think they fail completely, but that's my philosophical opinion. I think most people think he fails completely, but that's another question. Whether he does or not, this is for philosophers to go on looking at. But remember, there are always going to be disagreements. There is no final agreement about this. What is undoubtedly the case is nobody's actually done it. Nobody has actually ever reduced axiological explanation, consciousness, knowledge, evaluation, and decision-making to something that just uses the terms of physics. Now, you may think nobody would ever think of that, but Ed Wilson, of course, wrote a book called Consilience, in which that's precisely what he said. Every item of human consciousness, including love of music and love of God, all reduces to laws of physics. Well, it seems to me obvious that when you can't do it verbally, I can't even begin to think how you would actually do it. But I will say, to be honest, there are philosophers trying to do it. I will also say nobody's actually done it. So it's a statement of faith. It's a reductionist faith that you will be able to do it one day. My question would be, why should you have that faith? And I found that quite an interesting question. Why do people have the faith in reducible materialist science? Why is that such a strong faith? I occasionally look at the blog, which is Richard Dawkins' blog, which is called, I think, Reason and Science, the foundation. And the statements on that website are so full of hatred and stupidity and ignorance that I can't believe it. And these people just insult one another routinely every day. And these are all atheists, you know. It's not religious people doing this. It's people who are coming under the banner of reason and science. They say, what a fucking stupid statement. That's reason. So you have to ask the question, what is meant by reason in this context? And why should Dawkins and people like him associate reason with science? I don't know. So let me say a few words about reason. From the humanities point of view, if you're studying the humanities, any humanity, a reasonable view has to have two main components, if you hold a view reasonably. First of all, you have to know the criticisms that could be made of that view. You have to be self-critical. You have to search for the question, why do I see things in this way? What's my perspective? I happen to be, I can give you an account of what I am. I'm a fairly elderly English-speaking philosopher interested in religion. I'm a man. Okay. So that gives me a specific perspective, and I have to say, well, clearly that's going to limit the things that I'm going to say, and I will allow that I have to be very self-critical about that, open to why people disagree with me about that. So to be reasonable, I have to see what the deficiencies of my own view are, even though I'm probably not going to accept. I'm not going to change my mind, usually, but at least I can see that I'm not the only sensible person in the world. My view's only one among many. So self-criticism. Secondly, a very important thing if you're going to be reasonable is to be sympathetic to your opponents, to present their view in a way in which they would be happy to see it presented. That's the fundamental point. You don't present somebody else's view in a parodying way, as though it's a stereotype that they'd never accept. And that's what you don't get on Reason and Science blog. You never get a religious view presented sympathetically. It just doesn't happen. So it's an intrinsically irrational blog. It's an irrational website. It should be called Irrationality in Science. Because what it says is we are not going to be sympathetic to views which differ from ours. Richard Dawkins has said this quite explicitly. He said what we ought to do is ridicule religion. Don't respect it. He said it in his last public speech in London. Don't be so bloody respectful. Well, is that reasonable? It's rhetorical, certainly, but I think it wouldn't be called reasonable. So the two main things I want for reasonableness is appreciate the different points of view there are, appreciate them as sympathetic as you can. You don't have to agree with them. And I mean, it's even things like Nazism, National Socialism. Why was that view held? Trying to appreciate the perspective from what it is. After you've done that, but only after you've done it, you say, I think this is actually a corrupt view. And then the reason you say that it's corrupt is because you have your own reasons of a different sort, which you're critical about, and you're going to stick to. So after all that, the self-criticism and the appreciation of other points of view, you do have to have a commitment. You have to have a personal commitment. And so you have to say, I'm making this commitment. There are some commitments you can't avoid. I know it's not the only one in the world, but it's the best one I've come across. And that's what I would say as a Christian. I mean, Christianity is the best commitment. I mean, the way of life that you can have as a Christian, is for me the best, the most fulfilling, the most altruistic, ideally, that there is. And so I make that commitment. Now, of course, like all Christians, I suppose, I doubt specific things from time to time. I'm even very agnostic about lots of things, but if you've made the commitment, that's it. And once you're in an organisation, you can be very critical in that organisation. You don't toe the line, unless you unfortunately get appointed as an archbishop. So if you get yourself put into an official position, you may find yourself having to say things you don't really think, because people get so worried if you don't say them, really. And that's what made Rome resign, actually. But he had to say things that he doesn't think, in order to keep people quiet who otherwise would probably done terrible things. Not to him, but to other people. So, within the organisation, though, the best thing to be is to be like me, somebody that everybody can ignore because I'm just a professor and I'm not a bishop. So I don't have to speak for the faith, and that's a lovely place to be. So there you are. So you make a commitment. But actually, the reason I got ordained as a philosopher, and the reason I got ordained was I thought I've got to make a commitment. I've got to, at least if I'm ordained, people will say well, it's possible for a philosopher to believe this sort of stuff, but it's obviously not ridiculous. And I didn't want to go around preaching it all the time. So I thought, well, because I do, as a philosopher, change my mind every week. I feel I have to be committed to something. So that's part of it, right? Part of it, you say, when people say to me in the Dawkins line, you should only believe things as strongly as the evidence permits, I say, I couldn't live like that. Because my evidence doesn't allow me to believe anything. I'd never camp anywhere, right? I'd always say, yes, I see your point of view, perhaps I'll hold it today, and then tomorrow I'll see somebody else's point of view, so I'll hold that. So I make the commitment. I said, right, that's it. I got married with the same principle, and my wife was quite annoyed. One of the first things she said to me was, do you love me? And I said, well, what do you mean by love? I've never said that again. You make a commitment, and that is a part of which practical commitment becomes necessary, and I think that's true. I'm very much against the view. It was W.K. Clifford, the great humanist, who said you should never, ever, anywhere believe anything on insufficient evidence. And I think that you couldn't live that way. It's not. You're never going to have sufficient evidence. Never. Courts of law don't ask for that. I mean, they say they do, but they don't. Of course, the juries decide something, and we know that they disagree with each other, but they come to it. So you've got to commit, and you've got to commit reasonably. Okay. So what's this got to do with science? Well, when I'm in the sciences as an amateur, but it was when I was in Cambridge actually that I got involved in a little society called the Triangle Society, which probably still exists, doesn't it? Anyway, the Triangle was science, theology, and philosophy. And people in like John Polkinghorne and Arthur Peacock, and all the professors of philosophy, and some theologians as well. And that's what got me to have an instructor's interest in science. But it was apparent to me from the start, looking at scientists from the outside, they all disagree with each other. So on evolution, for example, and we heard this morning on cosmology, there are lots of different views, and the hard thing for a non-scientist to work out is which of these are actually firmly established and which of them are expressions of personal opinion. And that is extremely difficult. I don't think it's possible to give a general answer to that. You can't draw a line and say, this is firmly established now. This is a matter of personal opinion. I mean, I think it's true, is it not, that Albert Einstein, for the last years of his life, tried to undermine the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle as best he could. And he said, in the famous quote that he made, God does not play dice with the universe. But most people think he was wrong about that. But we still admire him for sticking to his guns, even though he was wrong. We admire him because it wasn't unreasonable for him to do that, even in the face of the evidence, because he was a great physicist, and it was possible that he was right, and if he hadn't stuck to it, he might never have proved that he was right. Well, he didn't prove he was right, but he might have. So there are lots of cases where he said, I hope you'll go on thinking that. And I might even say to Richard Dawkins, if I tried really hard, go on thinking that, because it's good to have a bit of opposition that makes you think critically about your own position. I might say that if he didn't ever talk about philosophy, I actually would say that. I'd say that some of the things he said about memes, for example, which I think are totally wrong, actually are very interesting. I hope he sticks to it, because it's nice to have people with wrong theories. But they'd be reasonable. They'd be reasoned. That's the point. So I'd look for disagreement. I think that's a good thing. So the different things to have the disagreement without failing to have the commitment. As I said, I don't think that commitment will come from science. I don't think your ultimate commitments will come from science. So this is the last question I raised this morning, is are there ontological commitments, fundamental ontological commitments, which are pre-scientific, which are at a level below that of science? And I think there clearly are. And one of them is the question which Dawkins answers in the negative: are there any questions which science cannot resolve? And he says no, there are. Now that's a fundamental ontological position because it's quite clear, and I think it's a proof, I mean, it's actually formal proof, it's quite clear you cannot answer that question scientifically. So if you ask the question, are there any questions which science cannot answer, there is no scientific way of answering that question. Okay? It's a philosophical question. And you have to make a decision. And to me, it's obvious, having been taught by HAA, I know there are millions of questions that science can't answer and hasn't even got the slightest interest in, but are very important to me. Like, what did I dream about last night? That's not very important to me, but I think I dreamt about something last night. I don't think science has the slightest interest in what it is, and I don't think science has any way of finding out what it was, and neither have I. So when I say that last night I dreamt about lying on a beach in the Bahamas, I just mean I remember dreaming that. I have no evidence whatsoever. I just remember it. But I know that I did. So I know something without evidence. Unless my experience itself is the evidence. But the experience is not repeatable. I mean, I had it and it's gone now, I'll never get it back again. My memory could be wrong, I could be wrong about it, but I'm going to say, I know that I dreamt last night. Now, that's just one of the things I know that scientists don't deal with or not very interested in. And of course, all moral questions are the same. And if you believe in objective moral truths, then you're going to say there are truths with which science doesn't deal with those questions. So if you make the fact-value distinction again, I wouldn't make it facts are objective, values are subjective. I'd make it that the natural sciences are concerned with natural physical events. They're not concerned with values, about the correctness. That's why mathematics is so difficult for science, actually. It's difficult because mathematics is, as Wittgenstein called it, a normative discipline. As I say, it deals in validity and invalidity, correctness and incorrectness, truth and falsity. So you're evaluating your arguments. If you're a mathematician, you're evaluating whether your arguments are good, whether they're elegant, whether they're beautiful, whether the statements follow from your premises, etc. You're evaluating things. But of course, the laws of physics don't evaluate anything. They just tell you what laws make things happen in closed causal systems. So I think there is a big philosophical problem between how you connect your values with your naturally established facts. In other words, how do you connect axiological explanation with nomological explanation? I can't answer that. I don't think anybody can answer that, but I'm sure you need both. And I think you get your axiological explanation at that fundamental ontological level. What are the things you really think are important in your life? And I suppose, in the end, I would say personal relationships. They're really important. And personal relationships are things where, I mean, I know psychologists call it theory of mind these days, but of course philosophers always had ways of talking about this, that you know that other people are not objects upon which you can experiment. And it's not going to be satisfactory always to explain what other people are doing in terms of scientific laws. In fact, you have no interest in that whatsoever. What you want to do is explain what they're doing in terms of their motives and their desires and their goals and their interests. And those are things which involve your personal evaluation, your perspective, because whether you like or dislike other people will depend on what you are like. And some you just won't like. And if you ask yourself the question of why not, it's largely because they show something that you're repressing in your own personality. Well, I won't go into all that, but I mean, personal evaluation is something different from examining phenomena in a laboratory, and that's my point. Personal knowledge, axiological explanation is quite different from nomological explanation, but you do want both. And in medicine, for example, there's a big question: do you want a doctor who is compassionate and humane, or do you want a doctor who can actually give you a drug that heals what's wrong with you? It's a big question. I want both. I want a bit of compassion and humaneness, that would be nice, but in the end I might want a drug. I do take a drug. It's only very good. It's for cholesterol. Okay? But I'm very happy to take that tablet and say, let's go and have my cholesterol. And I don't care if the doctor says, get out of my office, I'm sick of seeing you, I still want the tablet. So I don't care if they're humane and compassionate. It doesn't matter to me. But at other times, you do want humane, let's say, compassion. I just wouldn't actually go to my GP for that. But anyway, there you are. So you want both, and that's what I'm saying. So I'm not contrasting religion and science so much as the humanities, the humane subject. And I'm trying to contrast it with reasonableness or rationality with what Richard Dawkins talks about, which is, I would call evidentialism, which I think is irrational, fundamentally irrational. And evidentialism is the view stated by W.K. Clifford: you must never believe or commit yourself to anything unless you have sufficient evidence for it, which makes you a permanent agnostic and therefore uncommitted to anything worthwhile. So agnostics are possible, but there's something better. And I think with that, probably we'll start, having covered most of the things in here, but not necessarily, as you might say about chap playing piano. I got all the notes played, but not necessarily in the right order.
Thank you, Keith. I wanted to pick you up on your claim that you have had the personal experience of God in the person of Jesus, and you take that as evidence for God's existence. I'll grant you that it's evidence, but I'll suggest that it's possibly the worst form of evidence that a person can imagine. Whatever profound spiritual transformative experiences we might have, they are not and can never be taken as evidence for the metaphysical truth claims of one's religion. Had you been raised as a Muslim by Muslim parents in the Muslim culture of Muslim Pakistan, you would almost certainly not be a Christian, and you may interpret that same experience as being the all-loving presence of Allah, or something similar. But the experience that you would have would be precisely the same. How you interpret it would be determined by your particular religious belief.
Yeah. But it's quite interesting you say that, because as a matter of fact, Christianity wasn't my only option. I don't really disagree with what you say. I mean, in fact, I was brought up in a part of England which was very multi-religious.
Christianity is the predominant religion of the country. So even if your parents were atheists, you would almost certainly be Christian being brought up in Britain.
Are you saying anything different than, because I was brought up in a scientifically educated part of Britain, I've always accepted belief in evolution, but if I'd been brought up in Alabama, I might not have believed in evolution. Are you saying more than that? That's true. Yeah. Well, okay, but I still think I've got good evidence for evolution. Right. So I don't think that's a very good argument. If you say, if you had been brought up in a country where they'd never heard of Jesus, you wouldn't have been Christian. I think that's just true. But nevertheless, you do, if you're interested in religion particularly, you do have a fairly wide knowledge of what religions say. And of course, what I accept is your apprehension of a spirituality doesn't give you the Holy Trinity and the Incarnation and all that. Because of that, that has to be has to be interpretation. I entirely accept that. But the basic apprehension is something that, although it can be interpreted in many ways, it's not susceptible of a reductionist explanation without destroying the experience itself. Right? So I'm saying there's a basic, I'm not sure it's the same everywhere, but there's a basic sort of apprehension of a spiritual reality, and I think that's a possibility. I don't know why I should say it's not possible. I mean, it's actually the most important part of my life. So if you say it's not, if you say I'm deluded, I don't know what to respond to that exactly, except by saying, what's your test for my being deluded? Because on mental health grounds, I'm okay.
Well, I work in mental health as a psychologist and a therapist, so I distinguish between delusion, which is
I'm a psychologist.
Last comment.
Yeah, I'm a psychologist working in adult mental health. So a delusion, there's a difference between a delusion and a clinical delusion. A delusion is simply a false belief. A clinical delusion is a belief that is not shared commonly in one's culture. So, for instance, if a person didn't believe that a piece of bread was the body of Elvis, that would the person probably be insane. But if they believe it was a Jewish carpenter of the 1st century, that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
But
So the question would be,
the same.
the question is how do you know that a person who claims to have apprehended a spiritual reality is deluded or not? And I'm just saying I don't see any argument that they are deluded.
Okay, so we have another question. Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation, which is very, very interesting. And I think it's particularly generous of you to begin with some personal biography, philosophical biography, because I found that helped me to understand better what you had to say afterwards. Now, there's a story that H.B. Taylor presents in his autobiography. When he was at school, he was about 13, sitting in a history lesson, and extremely bored. And he had some Christian experience, because he would have gone to church practically every day, I expect. And because he was so bored, he was looking out of the window. And he looked at the window and he realised, he said, that there is no God. And that thought stayed with him for the rest of his life. It remained a personal commitment. Now, you described your personal experience, and I fully accept that as evidence. Because it seems to me that people obviously have different experiences or none at all. So it becomes difficult then to have maybe to have a good rapport and exchange with somebody whose experience is completely different. So you've got to allow for the possibility that there is a section of the population that have had and will never have an experience of the type that personal experience of the type you described. So what can we do with that? It seems to me that there are factors at play which are probably deterministic, such as genetics, personal constitution, which is set possibly right at the outset, which will determine how a person's understanding and commitments will evolve in their lifetime. And that there isn't very much you can do about that. There is also the whole question of commitment, which you described. And there are people who appear to have made what you might call deep materialistic commitments at some point in their lives, perhaps early on. I've got such students who simply say that religious experience is simply a brain event. They told me this, and they told me that science proves it. So we can just now, what do you do with this? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we all have a problem. I mean, suppose you have about 50% of the world's population which claims to have experiences of spiritual reality, which is non-human, but it is morally demanding in some sense, and also forgiving and compassionate, rather. And that's about right statistically on most surveys. But 50% don't have experiences. Some have very different sorts of experience. Well, I don't know what you do with that. You need some theoretical explanation of that. And all right, if you want me to give them one, you need that. I mean, the people who are atheists need to say that people like me are deluded, but I find that hard to accept that so many of us are. We're not odd particularly, so I find that not a very good explanation. Whereas a Christian explanation, for example, would be, now I've got to be very careful here, because I'm not saying it's anybody's fault, but that the human race is estranged from God by long generations of opposition to moral demands and the demands of God. So it's what we call original sin. And so a large part of the world's population will not be in a situation to know or recognise God. I think that would be the explanation, that the human race is estranged from God. And it needs the grace of God to overcome that. And as I say, I want to be very careful. I'm not blaming or praising people for this, but just saying that that's an alternative explanation. From a theistic point of view, you'd have to say some people, probably through no fault of their own, just are born into a culture or a place or have a psychology which blocks off the possibility of such apprehension of God.
Or apprehending the truth.
Yeah. I suppose I really want to say that everybody has an apprehension, which I would call an apprehension of God, but they wouldn't. But I'm pushing that a bit, so I'm not sure if that's fair of me to do that.
Thank you. So, yes, lady there.
Thank you very much. You talked a bit about objective moral truth, even though you said it might not be possible to know what those are, but the existence of moral truth might be a human question that couldn't be answered by science, and that's perfectly reasonable. My, I suppose, question would be, since the example you used was the killing of innocents, is it not therefore reasonable to make the claim that we should therefore abstain from war?
Yes, that would be reasonable.
So in that sense, you will be in disagreement of some of the stances taken by some religious groups, including Christian groups.
Oh yes, that's certainly true. I don't even have that. I mean, one of my points is you can't expect to get agreement.
Absolutely, but if the killing of the innocents was something that would generally obtain consensus, then abstaining from war would be reasonable.
There's a lot of discussion about this in the Christian tradition, of course, and I think the generally accepted view, most widely accepted view, is you can only use force against those who are themselves killing the innocent. I mean, you can't kill innocent. So that wouldn't rule out any use of violence. That's the generally accepted view. But of course there are Quakers and the Mennonites and many Christian groups which are completely pacifist.
Yes.
And I think that a Christian would have to say that's within the Christian perspective. It's a possibility.
Thank you.
Yes, the question there, second row.
Hi, Keith. Thank you for your talk. I should have one question. Could you explain how you might be able to distinguish between someone who thinks they have an experience of God and someone who actually has an experience of God?
Yeah. Well, we often try to do that. I mean, that is a common thing that one does in the Christian church. And the ways you would try to do that is just partly to see if they do have an appreciation of the different sorts of interpretations there are. If their interpretation leads to something that looks as though it contradicts a well-established fact, or if it leads them to make claims like hearing voices which tell them to do immoral things. I mean, there are ways of trying to find out. But I don't know if somebody doesn't look as though they've been led to an immoral or irrational belief, I would tend to believe what they say. Although I wouldn't necessarily believe the exact interpretation they give of what they say, because I agree with you that the interpretation will depend very much on what you've learned or what you know. But I think in the modern world that's actually not limited to one culture.
Thank you. So the question in the front here.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
Yes. It's a comment, or really on the point that you started with. I must say that I am apprehensive, to say the least, about your ready reliance upon personal experience in terms of religion. Because it seems to me that if one is at all objective about one's own experiences, one has to recognise that there are many people who claim exactly the same basis for very, very different religious beliefs, which cannot possibly be true if one's own are. And the argument paralleling it with, for instance, believing that one's wife loves one is only too aware that there are many, many people around, some of whom we know, have a similar belief, but they are in fact totally wrong about that. And so...
You mean their wives don't live?
Sorry?
You mean their wives don't love them?
Yes, yes. What appears to be love is in fact, something else.
Yeah.
One can very easily be misled totally about other people's...
Yeah.
And this suggests to me that the place of experience, personal experience, ought objectively to be much reduced in one's appreciation of what one believes. But I would say correspondingly that there are certain objective features about the world that science helps us to recognise, on which are thought of as natural theology, which ought in fact to have a very powerful influence upon our God beliefs, rather than subjective, fallible, personal experience.
Right. Well, I just disagree philosophically, basically, with that. I believe that this is a fundamental philosophical position, which of course is arguable, but it's mine, is that all knowledge begins with personal experience. That's where it all begins. And of course it's all fallible, and of course people can be wrong, but you don't have any alternative. That's it. So you sort out and you say, yes, it can't all be true, that's life, but it can't all be true. And we know that's the case. I mean, my daughter went to a school in France where she was taught that Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo. Or at least it was a tactical retreat, which was a victory in French words. So, I'm sorry about that, but it's true. So you get different views on history, and the fact you say they can't all be right doesn't stop you trying and committing yourself to the view. It just doesn't. That is the state we're in. We're in a state where we know people disagree. There's no way out of it. And if you're a materialist scientist, you're in the same position. You know that half the other scientists in the world don't agree with you at all, but you still stick to it. In fact, you might stick to it even more. What I find today is that the materialists are more dogmatic than the immaterialists. They're more certain that they're right. And I really, philosophically, I think that the view that there is an objective physical world out there, which is something like what it appears to us to be, I believe that's almost certainly false.
Yeah, thank you. So,
thank you for the talk, which I thought was very interesting. I just want to take up one point and ask for your opinion, if I understand it right. You mentioned the idea of human beings being separated from God by original sin or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever. Yeah. Does it follow from that the world in which we live is actively preventing us from having experiences of a living God?
Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, the most obvious example to me is television advertising. And if a child is brought up in Britain and watches television advertising, they will know that greed is good, but it's right to have a big car, lots of chocolates, and nice underclothes and everything else. And God is never mentioned. So it's just not in the culture. It's just not there at all.
That's the sort of thing I had in mind, that the world kind of bears in on it very strongly, very powerfully.
Yeah. It's good to be ambitious. The Apprentice is a fundamentally immoral program. In as much as it says that what matters is you winning in the race to make money. And you cannot serve both money and God. And so, yeah, I think that's true.
Can I just follow that by asking if the world as it is the world which is studied by scientists? Are scientists then missing something, or I'm not quite sure how to put it? Are scientists preventing us in some way by only studying the practicalities of the way the world is, or the laws which govern the way the world actually works? But it's that world which is preventing us, at least in part, from experiencing the reality.
Yeah, I would
scientists are in fact implicit in something.
I wouldn't say scientists as such, but I think there are quite a lot of scientists who are materialists, and they exclude any supernatural creator of God. They exclude that. That's that fundamental ontology that's just not there. So obviously that's going to lead you to certain conclusions in science. For example, when Michael Ruse was talking about evolution, he couldn't have a God to direct how things happen. So that's just not on the cards. It's not even on the agenda. So it has to be undirected and unguided. It just has to be. There's no alternative. Right? Whereas if you're a theist, you'd think, well, I don't think it's as easy as that. And of course, evolutionists divide all along the lines on that. So I think that's what I was saying, fundamental ontological commitments do affect some of the things you're going to say in science. But I mean, if you're doing stuff in the laboratory, it doesn't necessarily have any effect. It's when you're going to make these large-scale statements about the human mind, or about whether there's purpose in the universe. And I think those are the two big areas of dispute. From a philosophical point of view, I'd say that anyone who says the mind is identical with the brain has a fundamental ontological commitment, with which I disagree. So I couldn't agree with that. So when neurophysiologists talk about the hard problem of consciousness, I don't even see that that's a problem. Because what they think the hard problem is how, out of the twittering of lots of neurons, do you get awareness of objects? And I don't think you do, so it's no problem. Well, it's a philosophical problem, but it's a sort of problem you say, it's a mystery, it's something we don't fully understand, but it's no worse than the problem of why one thing causes another, which I don't understand anyway. How can one thing cause another?
Thank you. Yeah.
I have two questions, if I may. I don't know if I understood you well when you said something that knowledge comes from personal experience, and if you don't agree with what I think is true, then you are corrupt. And that is very much a reliance on your personal experience to justify a particular belief. Don't you think that this is opening a door for possible fanaticism? I mean, we have heard these arguments very often in fanatics that just think they own the truth. And the other question is, you claimed you know probably that you're not crazy or.
I believe that.
Yeah, the problem is, how would you know that you're not? I mean, if you practice self-deception, you're not aware that you are deluded because you are deceiving yourself. So you have no proof that you are normal.
Okay, can we stop there?
Yes.
First of all, on the fanatics, I mean, I was at some pains to say that you must never be sure that you're right. Now, I did say, you picked up on that, if some English school child of 18 years old said to me that killing the innocent was all right, I would say to them, that is a corrupt view. Because I want to train them morally to think that that is a corrupt view. That's what I want to do that. I want to persuade them of that. But of course, I'm very much aware that hard questions, like is abortion permissible, much harder question, then perhaps one ought to be a lot more nuanced about how certain you could be about the truth of that. Okay. So I'm not saying you can just believe anything you like and everybody else is corrupt. I'm not saying that. It's that believing in objective truth will lead you to often say, I'm not sure that I've got this right. So that's that one. And how do I know I'm not crazy? Well, there are standard psychiatric tests for that. I've done quite a lot of them so far. What else can you do? I mean, what can you say? But you do actually judge. We each make the judgment at other people. You say, is this person very intelligent, or has this person got wisdom, or has this person got insight? You make those judgments, but you'll realise when you make them, you're putting something of yourself into them. Yeah. So I'm just saying there's no escape. You shouldn't be surprised about this. It's just the human condition. There is no way of getting purely objective knowledge.
But we have a tendency to consider others who agree with us as very wise.
That's probably quite natural, yes. So we have to guard against that. Yeah.
Hello, press board. Now, just going back a minute ago, did I understand you to say, I'm trying to keep this to what you were supposed to be on here, perspective on philosophy of science related. Science deals with the world, and like process of induction and so on, investigate it. Now, did I understand you say you didn't really believe there was an objective world out there? Are you a skeptic? Philosophy. Because I'm very much the opposite, you see. I believe that there's a real world out there, and in terms I see it. Now, would you agree with, I think you would disagree, if I heard you correctly. I mean, this is interesting because it's basic, isn't it? I mean, there is a world out there. I'm convinced of it. I mean, Dr. Johnson...
How do you know?
Well, now, I know what it is. You see, Dr. Johnson, Bishop Berkeley,
yes.
The idealist party, 18th century Ireland. Yes. Idealism. Now, idealism, you rightly pointed out, is the philosophical idea that all reality is mental.
Yeah, I am.
But Bishop Berkeley went so far as to say that there is no such thing as physicality.
Well,
when you read that, and Dr. Johnson said, in reaction to Berkeley, I remember this, I forgot this. He said, if I go out and kick my foot on a stone, I know that's stone. Now, are you in the philosophical skeptical tradition?
No, I'm not skeptic. No.
What did you mean by it?
What I said
was... I think this is relevant because, this is your philosophy, perspective on the philosophy of science. Now, for science to be of any value and have any worth at all, there is a world out there to investigate.
Yes.
You do accept that?
Yes.
Right, well, what can you clarify what you meant, Professor Reed, or an idiot like me?
Okay. What I said. I think it's because you've got the microphone up. What I said, I'm not being allowed to say this again, was that it is not the case, according to quantum physics, I didn't say that, I'm reading it now, it is not the case that there is a world out there, a public object, which look like this world looks to us.
When you're at the quantum level?
Any level at all. What I mean is... I think it's just a fact. I don't think it's even disputable. I mean, I think it's just...
philosophers.
What?
Indian philosophers, Hindus.
Hindus,
They, some of them regard the world as a total illusion. Would you go along with that? I mean, it's not to me at all, it's very real.
If you don't... No. Okay.
Because this is fundamental, because if there's no world there, what is science?
No, you're not saying there's no world there.
I know you're there, I hope you know I'm
Can I rephrase, what kind of, what does that sense perception give us? It's an imperfect perception of the world, or a perception of a world that isn't there at all, or, I suppose one can clarify it.
Supposing you ask, and I have asked, a good quantum physicist what is really there in the world when we're not conscious of it, the answer I got from at least one quantum physicist in Oxford was it's an 11-dimensional reality of eigenwaves in Hilbert space. That's what I say. That's nothing like what I'm looking at. So what I'm looking at is not what a quantum physicist would describe the world as. And I would, of course there is a world out there, of course there is, but I am an idealist.
Right.
which doesn't mean there's no world out there. It means the world that you perceive is a construct of your mental, cognitive apparatus.
But how far do you go along with Bishop Clark?
He's very much misunderstood.
I mean, I don't like
he didn't. It doesn't. Look, I will quote not Bishop Berkeley, but John Wheeler. John Wheeler, physicist, very good physicist, and he would say that without mind, without consciousness, there is no physical reality.
Well, now then, you see, this brings to mind a philosophical conundrum known to lots of philosophers some years ago. The tree in the quad, you see. You know that. When they go to sleep at night, the question is it still there? Well, I would say, if I get up in the morning and see it, I say it's been there all night. Now, Albert Einstein, well, that's the same bad thing about the moon. He said, when you go to sleep at night, President, is the moon still? He said, of course it is.
We've got that point. We can response to that. Yeah.
The most obvious case is, look, you're sitting here and you look to me like solid objects wearing coloured clothes. You are not actually solid objects, and there are no colours in reality.
You were mentioning earlier about the importance of experiences. Just your comments on, I would say that it is verifiable, but verifiable in action. How does it affect our lives in the future? By their fruits, you should know. How does that experience affect the way you then live? Does that not, in some degree, verify the original experience?
Yeah. Well, back to Faraday for a moment. I mean, he virtually invented in England the verification principle. But as I said, most people misunderstand that. What he meant by that is you could, in your personal experience, apprehend something that convinced you that something was true, like this is red. To verify this, for me to see that it's red, it's got nothing to do with anybody else at all. That's verification. I think in religion there is verification. We hope, in Christian life, we hope I will know and love God fully. But it's not going to happen in this life. So I believe in what John Hick called eschatological verification. That is, everyone will come to see there's a God, but of course, I have the advantage that can never be falsified. Right. It's not my fault, that's just the way it is.
I'm going to allow Martin one more. Quickly.
Can I first quickly ask you, do you agree with Dennis Alexander when he asks on the Faraday for Schools website an example of a question that is not scientific is, how do I know that my wife loves me?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, can I suggest that that is it's maybe not a question that is purely scientific, but it can be answered scientifically. First, let me define what a scientific question is. A question is scientific if it requires empirical evidence for its answer. That's a fairly, I think, non-contentious definition. Can we gather evidence to prove that a wife loves her husband? I think the answer is obviously yes. Firstly, we can ask her. That's evidence. We can ask our friends and our family who know her and who she talks to about her relationship. We can observe her behaviour. We would expect that a wife who loves her husband would behave rather differently from a wife who doesn't. We can put her in a brain scanner and observe differences in brain activity when she uses photos of her husband compared to men that she does not love, for instance. If it's true that she loves her husband, all the evidence should converge on the same conclusion. It is therefore a question of scientific.
No, I don't agree. I agree with everything you said except for your last sentence. In fact, there is a case, a very sad case, of a man who lived with his wife for 40 years. When he died, they had a very good relationship. When he died, he left a note saying, I have hated you all these years. And I think, well, what a terrible thing to do. But it's possible. And I think there are depths of the human psyche that we cannot probe, even with a brain scanner. And that if you put somebody in a brain scanner, you're going to get very artificial results. And you stick it in there and you say, keeps.
It's one line of evidence out of So,
I'm not denying there is evidence. If you mean evidence in a rather loose sense, there are things which will go to support. As I say in the last bit of my handout, of course, there is scientific evidence. I mean, suffering is evidence against God. I accept that. Okay. So there is evidence for and against. I'm just saying it's not conclusive. It's evidence that you could interpret in different ways. But it's all based on personal experience. And talking about love, see, that word itself is very, very difficult to interpret. But I certainly think that could be a difficult one. But I would think if you wanted to know what a person's feelings about somebody else really were, would you go to a brain scanner or a psychoanalyst to find out?
we would go to psychoanalysts because I picked the CBTs.
And I think that wouldn't be evidence in the same sense. That would be personal knowledge.
Maybe one quick one to finish up with.
When you talk about the nominological and the axiological, that, like last night when we heard Michael Roos, sounded somewhat like the two spheres theory, that we've got a world that is appropriate for scientific investigation and another world that's more appropriate for ethical or religious thinking. So this is sort of, I'm asking you this question, but I think it's a question that could be asked of any of the speakers. You said that you want both, but are there good reasons why we should have both? I agree that we want both, ideally. So the question for me is, what principles would the axiological and nominological share in common that allow both to coexist peacefully? Because there must be a set of metaphysical principles that grounds both of them, that goes beyond, in a sense, or you can use transcendence or grounding, however you want to use it, that grounds both of them, that they share in common, that somehow allows both to exist. The reason why Dawkins fails is because he doesn't have any metaphysical principles that he shares in common with his enemy. And so, if you're going to talk about the principle of love, which I agree with, what is that principle which allows individuals to love both the axiological and nominological?
Okay, that's a good question to end on, I think, because what I want to say, basically, a bit compressed this, but that God is the supreme axiological explanation of the universe. If you accept this explanation, then God knows every possible universe that could exist, evaluates them, and chooses one for the reason that it will realize certain intrinsic goods that could not exist in any other universe. In other words, there is a reason why the universe exists. Now, a nomological explanation cannot give you such a reason. A nomological explanation will end with a set of quantum laws which are just there. And you say, why are they there? And there's no answer to that. So I think you need two aspects for a complete explanation of why the universe exists. Same question, that's the common link. Why does it exist? You're asking the same question. And there are two answers. One is that it exists because it has to. That's the necessity of nomological explanation that physicists would like to find. And there's explanation in terms of value, because it's intrinsically good that it exists.
So I understand that, and I see the consistency. However, it doesn't really fit the notion that there are a deeper set of principles that ground both. I mean, basically, you've made the axiological the ground of the nominological.
Yeah.
And so, in that case, the nominological has to accept the axiological principles that you're putting forward. So there's no, in other words, there's no equality there. That's what I'm saying in the way you're approaching it.
Okay, the axiological wins.
Right.
I am an idealist, yeah, it's fine. That's right.
Thank you, and I think I'll probably no doubt come back to that. So thank you very much indeed. Really good.